In an unprecedented move that shook the monarchy's core, King Charles dismissed key palace aides not for treason nor corruption, but for daring to question a school application. Overnight, careers were ruined, silence fell, and a single boy, Prince George, became the center of a storm the firm never saw coming. But this wasn't just a firing. It was a warning. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It started with whispers. Quiet ones, barely audible in the corners of the palace. Concerns, not rebellions. Caution, not confrontation. But in a house built on secrecy, even a murmur can sound like thunder. 3 officials, senior, respected, and handpicked by the late Queen herself, found themselves out on the street with little more than a signed letter and an unspoken threat hanging over their heads. Their crime? Questioning the scope, timing, and ambition of Prince George's new educational path. Not its value, no one doubted the importance of the boy's future, but its implications. The nature of his grooming, the pace, the cost, and most dangerously, the intent. The statement from the palace was sterile. Irreconcilable differences regarding the prince's future. It read, a cold sentence with 1,000 hidden meanings. Behind closed doors, insiders weren't as diplomatic. One former equerry called it a decapitation strike. Another said it was about more than a school, it was about who controls the future monarch's mind. That phrase lingered like poison in the air, because in the firm, education is never just education. It is propaganda, power, and preparation for a role that bends the child to the throne, not the other way around. The news broke with muted urgency. Major outlets reported the firings with careful language, burying them beneath fluff stories and hollow quotes. But the real drama wasn't on the news. It was in the silences that followed. Staff stopped making eye contact. WhatsApp groups went dark, and in private, aides muttered the same phrase over and over like a curse. It's about George. It's always been about George. No one could say more. Not publicly. Not even to family. NDAs were reinforced. Security patrols increased. And then, the media blackout began. Rumors of gag orders surfaced as quickly as they were shut down. Internal memos warned staff not to speculate on strategic decisions. Even seasoned royals kept their distance. One source claimed Camilla looked visibly disturbed during a recent engagement, her words terse, her body language stiff. Whatever had happened behind those walls, whatever had forced Charles to burn 3 trusted advisors overnight, it had to be something explosive, something that couldn't wait, something that couldn't risk exposure. Why yesterday? That was the chilling question. What had shifted so drastically that the king had to strike before dawn, broke on a new news cycle? What had happened behind those stone walls, what was said, promised, or threatened that forced this purge to occur without warning? But what exactly was said in those private meetings that provoked such royal wrath? Let's step inside the palace walls the day before the purge and uncover the conversation that changed everything. What if the royal future was decided not in Parliament, nor at the Queen's old desk, but in a dimly lit conference room beneath Buckingham Palace? The day before the purge, tensions boiled behind polished mahogany doors, words were exchanged that could never be taken back. It was supposed to be routine, an internal briefing to finalize Prince George's academic trajectory. No media, no press releases, just trusted faces seated in what should have been a secure, composed strategy session. But even before the doors closed, the tone was off. The king arrived late, his eyes dark, his jaw set. The aides who dared speak that day would later call the air in the room suffocating, as if everyone knew the conversation ahead might end careers or worse, loyalties. As the meeting commenced, a senior advisor raised the first red flag. George, he said, was showing visible signs of strain, nightmares, isolation, withdrawn moods. The relentless weight of expectation of duty over childhood was beginning to manifest. Another aide added that the boy had once asked, "Will I ever be normal?" A heavy silence followed, but Charles didn't flinch. Instead, he shifted focus, unfurling a detailed curriculum that stretched far beyond textbooks and term papers. It read more like the blueprint for a statesman than a syllabus for a schoolboy. That's when the second rupture came. A suggestion to send George abroad, even for a year. To let him breathe. Be among peers who didn't address him as "Your Royal Highness." But the proposal was met with icy rejection. The king's response was swift and final. He must remain visible. He must remain here. The throne has no time for retreat. Camilla, sensing the unease, gently intervened, trying to soften the tone. She spoke about balance, about preserving the boy's spirit while preparing him for leadership. But Charles cut her off. The look he gave her, stern, unmoved, chilled the room. The conversation began to fray. One aide, trying to reason, dared utter what would become the quote, whispered throughout the palace in fear. "He's the brand." The phrase hung in the air like smoke, half truth, half treason. For a moment, no one breathed. Then the king spoke, voice low and cold. "Exactly," he said. "That's why none of you understand what's at stake." The room fell silent again, but this time, it wasn't awkward, it was ominous. The old rules had just been rewritten. By the time the meeting adjourned, alliances had cracked. What began as a discussion had turned into a veiled confrontation. Camilla's expression was unreadable, but her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her papers. The aides walked out in silence, each of them realizing they'd crossed a line they never saw coming. No official memo would mention what happened in that room. But within 24 hours, 3 of them would be gone, names erased, files sealed, careers reduced to whispers behind velvet curtains. But why such sensitivity around a boy's education? The answer lies in a secret vision Charles has harbored for decades, a royal future few would dare to imagine. Long before Charles became king, he made a private vow. "My heir will not repeat my pain." Now, that vision has taken on radical form, pushing George toward a destiny so carefully constructed, it leaves no room for error or opposition. The ghost of Charles's own childhood has never truly left him. Beneath the royal titles and ceremonial smiles lies a boy who was raised in silence, shamed for showing emotion, and often treated more as a national asset than a son. His relationship with Prince Philip was marked by discipline, distance, and unmet expectations, a dynamic that hardened the young prince into someone who equated love with control and duty with survival. When Charles finally ascended to the throne, he wasn't just accepting a crown, he was inheriting every wound it had inflicted. And with George now standing in line, Charles saw a second chance not to heal, but to perfect. He fears irrelevance more than he fears scandal. In hushed conversations with close confidants, Charles has reportedly drawn chilling comparisons between George and his great-uncle Edward VIII, the king who abdicated not just his throne, but his purpose. "We don't raise ornaments," Charles once snapped at a staff member. "We raise anchors." The implication was clear: George wouldn't be allowed to float along as a figurehead. He would be rooted, armoured, and engineered to lead, not merely appear. That engineering began in secret, away from the public's eye. The king began meeting with individuals few would associate with royal tutoring, former intelligence officers, ex-diplomats, and AI, behavioral scientists. The goal wasn't just education, it was influence. How to control it, how to resist it, and most disturbingly, how to weaponize it. George was to be trained not just in geography and history, but in the architecture of power, political warfare, information shaping, covert diplomacy. This wasn't a syllabus, it was a playbook. Even within the palace, few knew the full extent of what was being implemented. There were whispers of Charles coordinating with an elite academic consortium, one with rumoured ties to psychological operations training in the defence sector. Their campus is unlisted, their board anonymous, but according to a source close to the decision, they don't educate leaders, they manufacture them. It's here, the source claims, that Charles intends to eventually place George far from the flashbulbs, but at the very core of the monarchy's recalibration. All of this, of course, is being done under a singular belief uttered by the king himself, behind tightly sealed doors. "I'm not raising a child. I'm building a monarch." Those words weren't said with cruelty, but with chilling conviction. For Charles, this isn't about control. It's about redemption, about sculpting a future that cannot betray him the way the past did. George isn't just his son, he's the final act in Charles's lifelong war with weakness, doubt, and irrelevance. But building a monarch means eliminating distractions and enemies. And in the eyes of the crown, Dissent is the greatest threat of all. They were loyalists, sworn to serve crown and country. But when they questioned the king's methods, their loyalty was turned against them. Now, their careers are destroyed, their reputations erased, and their only crime, protecting a child. These weren't rebels. They weren't radicals or Republicans or palace opportunists. They were the inner circle, the ones chosen because of their discretion, their discipline, and above all because they knew when to remain silent. But this time, they spoke, not to the press, not to the people, but to the king himself. And in doing so, they crossed a line they never even knew existed. The education advisor, a former Oxford fellow with 2 decades of royal service, the chief equerry, a decorated military man who had escorted both Queen Elizabeth and King Charles through moments of national crisis, and the Deputy of Communications, a strategist credited with rehabilitating Charles's public image during some of the darkest years of his reign. Expelled. The whispers began weeks before. Concerns about George's deteriorating emotional state. The withdrawn expressions, the weight behind his words, the way he flinched whenever the word duty was used in his presence. A private report, reportedly circulated only among top aides, warned of anxiety-induced insomnia and social detachment. The education advisor raised the first flag. He argued that George needed reprieve, not acceleration. The boy was absorbing too much, too fast. And when he voiced that aloud in a planning session, the room froze. Charles, already under pressure, reportedly clenched his jaw, said nothing, then ended the meeting prematurely. The chief equerry was next. Loyal to the crown, but deeply protective of the heir. He confided to a colleague, "The pace is inhuman, even soldiers get time to recover." And then came the final misstep, the communications deputy. She proposed reducing George's public appearances, citing the boy's clear discomfort under scrutiny. Her suggestion, though couched in strategy, was interpreted as defiance, a threat to the image the king was meticulously crafting. That was the final crack. And then, the machine moved. Days before the firings, strange patterns emerged. Schedules were changed without warning, emails were redirected. Their offices were suddenly reassigned under the pretense of renovation. One staffer, speaking on condition of anonymity, said plainly, "They were trying to slow the machine. The machine doesn't stop." Surveillance was increased. Conversations felt monitored. Even their personal assistants grew distant. And then came the day of reckoning. It wasn't a confrontation. It was an execution, bureaucratic and brutal. Termination letters delivered with military precision. No press statement, no explanation. One of them was reportedly escorted out by security, the palace gates shutting behind her like a prison door. Their names were quietly scrubbed from internal directories. Their legacies dissolved in silence. And in the palace, no one dared mention them again, not because they were forgotten, but because they were a warning. But if Charles was willing to purge his inner circle, what else might he be? Hiding about Prince George's future? Ballet? Maths? History? But inside the palace, George is allegedly being groomed in secret disciplines, psychological warfare, elite persuasion tactics, and the study of global power dynasties. A future monarch, trained like a covert weapon. To the public, Prince George is the portrait of innocence, an emblem of continuity, smiling politely at school recitals and waving from balconies. But behind the locked doors of royal apartments, a far more calculated reality is unfolding. According to those closest to the shadows, his upbringing is anything but traditional. The curriculum designed for George is not just academic, it is strategic. At the heart of it are private tutors whose resumes read like the alumni list of clandestine agencies, former intelligence officers, behavioral analysts. Cold War veterans repurposed for a new kind of battlefield. Perception. While other children recite poetry, George is reportedly dissecting speeches. Not for meaning, but for manipulation. Lessons on ancient monarchies are interwoven with psychological conditioning. Lessons crafted to instill authority, precision, and control. Sources whisper that his school hours do not end with the final bell. Once the other children have gone home, George allegedly stays behind or is whisked away to private evening sessions where language is studied not for fluency, but for command, where history is not about facts, but about how it's told and who gets to tell it. The material? Chilling. Leaked accounts claim George's reading list includes Machiavelli's The Prince and Sun Tzu's Art of War, not as historical studies, but as modern frameworks. Royal aides reportedly found a heavily annotated copy of the 48 Laws of Power tucked between palace lesson plans. And while the world debates screen time limits for children, George has no access to social media, not for protection, but by design. The monarchy is crafting someone for immune to distraction, immune to emotion. His friendships are tightly monitored, his speech reviewed, his expressions trained. An insider familiar with the boy's day-to-day life summed it up in one sentence that now echoes like prophecy. He's learning to rule, not to live. That quote didn't come from a journalist, or even a former aide. It came from someone inside the walls who once worked with George personally. A mentor who, after voicing concern, was quietly removed from the rotation. Their warning now serves as a grim thesis. That the monarchy isn't just preparing George for kingship, it's preparing him to become its ultimate instrument of control. And in this high-stakes operation, emotion is risk, individuality is noise. George is not being raised to ask why, he's being taught to ask how to win, how to persuade, how to dominate the narrative before it forms. But in constructing this perfect heir, flawless, poised, and invulnerable, the royals may have overlooked one dangerous truth. No system is without consequence. No pressure comes without fracture. But as pressure builds on the boy king in training, the cracks are beginning to show, and one chilling incident may prove the royal project is already spiraling. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend retreat, but what happened at Windsor Castle left the Queen Consort in tears and forced George's mother, Catherine, to take a step the palace tried desperately to bury. The royal family had gathered under the pretense of rest, a rare pause from the noise of headlines and protocol. But what unfolded that night was anything but peaceful. According to insiders, it began as a subtle shift in George's demeanour. He had been unusually quiet throughout the day, barely touching his food, eyes cast downward, but no one expected the storm that would follow. Late into the evening, the silence broke loud, sudden, and unmistakable. Shouting echoed through the halls. Staff members froze. George had locked himself in a guest room, sobbing and screaming, "I don't want to be king." His voice cracked with panic, and when aides tried to calm him, he only screamed louder, his fists reportedly banging against the door in a way no royal had ever dared. The Queen Consort, caught off guard, was seen visibly shaken. According to one account, Camilla wept quietly as the boy's cries pierced the walls of the historic estate, but it was Catherine who reacted with thunder. She rushed to the scene, demanding privacy, pushing past stunned staff and entering the room alone. What was said between mother and son remains sealed behind those thick castle walls, but what happened next ignited the most private war the family had faced in years. Catherine emerged pale, resolute, and furious. For the first time since Charles ascended the throne, she directly confronted him not as the future queen, but as a mother whose child was unraveling. She laid out the damage plainly. The pressure, the silence, the isolation. She didn't mince words. George was breaking, and if something didn't change, he would shatter. But Charles, according to sources present, dismissed her concerns with cold detachment. Growing pains, he called it. We all go through them. It was the kind of response that ended conversations. But this time, Catherine didn't retreat. She threatened to act, In a closed-door exchange that has since been whispered about in tense tones by palace staff, she suggested removing George from all royal duties indefinitely. The very idea sent shockwaves through Windsor, a future king stepping back before he'd even begun. The aides who witnessed the aftermath described an atmosphere colder than war. No shouting, no rage, just a silence so sharp it drew blood. Charles didn't speak to Catherine for the rest of the evening. Camilla, visibly distressed, attempted to mediate, but the emotional lines had been drawn. Catherine retired to her quarters, early, with George by her side, and the palace quietly moved to erase all mention of the night. The next morning, the Windsor staff were instructed not to speak of what they had heard, but the damage was already done, and the fracture between duty and family had never been more visible. But behind every emotional breakdown lies a deeper secret, and Catherine has one of her own, she's kept hidden for years. Behind her composed smile, the Princess of Wales has been carrying a secret. A deal she made with Charles during the early days of George's public life. And now, with her son unravelling, that ultimatum has been triggered with consequences no one in the family was ready for. Years ago, before the cameras had ever focused on George's polished wave or the public had memorized the tilt of his royal posture, Catherine sat across from Charles in a private study. The monarchy was preparing its next public chapter. George was barely out of toddlerhood, and yet discussions were already swirling about press appearances, school enrollments, royal expectations. Catherine had remained calm during most of it until the king mentioned exposure. That's when she drew her line. Softly but firmly, she made a single condition. That moment became the unspoken pact between them, filed away, ignored, almost forgotten. But Catherine never forgot. She watched silently as the carefully curated image of her son took form. The polished outfits, the scripted smiles, the relentless preparation masked as gentle grooming. At first, she convinced herself it was all manageable, that she could shield him quietly, from within. But over time, George began to change. The light in his eyes dimmed. The boy who once asked if clouds could touch castles, now asked if being king meant never feeling tired. She kept smiling for the cameras, as she always had, but the pressure was quietly crushing her. What made it worse was that Camilla the Queen Consort stood in Charles's corner. Where Catherine saw a child under siege, Camilla saw a duty being fulfilled. The two women, always cordial in public, began to clash behind the scenes. Small remarks turned into veiled arguments. Camilla reportedly told a staffer, "This is what monarchy looks like." Catherine replied days later, cold and clipped, "No, this is what it sounds like when no one listens." Catherine had begun documenting everything. In the margins of her planner, in the pages of a locked journal hidden away from even the palace staff, the sleepless nights, the tears behind closed doors, George's questions, his silence, his outbursts. It wasn't paranoia, it was proof. A record she could no longer keep in her head. According to a source close to her inner circle, Catherine had also begun quietly exploring what a semi-withdrawal from royal duties would mean not for her, but for George. And what the fallout might look like if she acted on the deal she made long ago. Now, that deal loomed like a loaded weapon. Catherine had warned Charles once. She wouldn't warn him again. Whispers of a possible rift began circling within palace corridors. Some staff began shifting allegiances. Others grew cold, preparing for what felt inevitable. Because when the future queen threatens to walk away not from the crown, but with its heir in hand, the institution itself begins to tremble. As cracks spread across the royal family, the media begins to circle, but someone inside the palace is feeding them. From encrypted messages to anonymous leaks, someone inside the palace is playing a dangerous game. They've risked everything to expose what's happening to George, and their trail of breadcrumbs may now lead straight to the king's own bloodline. It began with a single email, encrypted, unsigned, and sent to a veteran royal correspondent known for exposing quiet truths buried beneath royal polish. Attached were heavily redacted documents, fragments of schedules, unusual travel records, a curriculum that didn't match what the public had been told. And buried in the metadata, an unmistakable detail references to non-disclosure policies signed by tutors and handlers, not teachers. This wasn't education. This was containment. Within days, more leaks followed. Scans of private correspondence, hints of a classified program codenamed internally as the Temperance Track. Then came the footage. Blurry but real George, in what appeared to be a study chamber, breaking down in tears as a figure off-camera quietly demands he focus on the obligation, not the feeling. The clip went viral within hours, but it wasn't posted by an outsider. It was emailed directly to 4 news agencies by a source calling themselves Regulus, Latin for Little King. Speculation exploded. Who was Regulus? How did they have access to secure palace systems? And more importantly, why now? The Royal Press Office denied the authenticity, but the damage was already done. For the first time, the public saw not a prince, but a prisoner. Not a legacy, but a warning. Inside the palace, panic took root. Charles reportedly erupted in fury. An internal directive was issued overnight. Identify the leak, neutralize the threat, control the narrative. But the harder they looked, the more confusing it became. Digital fingerprints led nowhere. Clues seemed planted. Then came the real shock. One of the emails was traced back to an encrypted device previously used by a minor royal cousin. Not a tabloid regular, not a rogue activist, but someone from within the bloodline, someone with motive, with access, with something to prove. The king convened a confidential task force, bypassing even senior aides. Staff were quietly questioned. Devices were seized. Resignations began trickling in, some voluntary, others clearly forced. Those who left did so without statements, without farewells, just silence. A silence, laced with fear. One insider said, "The palace hasn't felt this tense since Diana's final days." Another simply murmured, "Everyone's watching their own back now." Meanwhile, Regulus wasn't finished. A final document was teased, one that, if released, could expose the depth of Charles's project for George, and potentially call into question the very nature of succession. Rumours swirled. A psychiatric evaluation? A hidden clause in a will? A filmed confrontation between father and son? No one knew. But everyone understood the stakes. If the monarchy was built on perception, then Regulus was about to shatter the illusion completely. But this isn't just about power anymore, it's about survival. In sacrificing trust to preserve control, King Charles may have set fire to the very institution he swore to protect. As the dust settles and George's fate hangs in the balance, one haunting question remains. Was it worth it? The king's first move was to confront the narrative head-on. A somber, carefully crafted public statement was released, a declaration cloaked in dignity, insisting that recent internal adjustments were made solely for the protection of the young prince's stability and future. The message was polished, almost sterile, and seemed designed to suffocate questions rather than answer them. But the public didn't buy it. Analysts tore it apart within minutes. Where was the warmth? Where was the reassurance? Where was the boy at the center of this firestorm? Instead of calming the nation, Charles had only fueled suspicion, leaving people to wonder whether he was guarding his grandson or guarding himself. Catherine's silence was even louder. Once the steady heartbeat of royal public life, she vanished almost overnight. No school runs, no charity engagements, no reassuring smiles beside George. The absence triggered a wave of speculation. Had she stepped back in protest? Was she protecting her son? Or had the palace pressured her into silence to preserve the fractured facade of unity? Whatever the truth, one thing was undeniable. The country noticed her disappearance more than the king's explanation. Without Catherine, the monarchy suddenly felt hollow, an echo of itself, stripped of its most human element. Then came the numbers. Polls shifted rapidly, showing a steep decline in support for the monarchy's next generation. Even those who had once believed in the promise of a modern royal family began to question whether it had all been an illusion. Parents voiced concern, educators voiced outrage, and quietly, almost cautiously, Several elite schools signaled that they were no longer comfortable participating in the educational programs proposed for the young prince. Private institutions that once boasted royal partnerships began stepping away, citing misalignment with institutional values. The message beneath their diplomatic language was unmistakable. They didn't want to be complicit. Meanwhile, George disappeared from public life entirely. The boy who once represented continuity, innocence, and hope was now a shadow, tucked behind heavy curtains and tighter schedules. His absence became the loudest story of them all. Was he studying abroad? Was he being shielded? Or was the palace hiding a deeper fracture, one that no press statement could mend? Even palace insiders admitted that sightings had become rare. The future king was becoming a ghost in his own story. And so the question lingered, growing heavier with each passing day. What price had been paid for the illusion of control? Because power gained through secrecy is never secure. Influence protected through fear always fractures, and a child raised in the crossfire of ambition can never escape its echo. As one senior aide whispered on the brink of resignation, "He may wear the crown one day, but at what cost?" Now the world watches a monarchy standing on trembling ground, a king clinging to control, a mother guarding her silence, a nation questioning everything it once believed about royal strength, and somewhere behind those palace walls, a boy carrying the weight of a kingdom he never asked to rule. And as one king silences voices to secure the future, the world watches in silence, waiting to see if Prince George will ever find his own. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.